Hello, my name is Andrew Ahn Westover, and I'm the Keith Haring Director of Education and Public Engagement at the New Museum. I join you today from the unceded land of Lenape people, and I'd like to begin by acknowledging and paying respect to Lenape people and elders and ancestors, past, present, and future. On behalf of the New Museum, I am glad to welcome you to today's conversation between Dawoud Bey and Gary Carrion-Murayari. This program series includes over a dozen artist conversations presented in conjunction with our current exhibition, Grief and Grievance, Art and Mourning in America. Programs like this are core to the New Museum's work of advancing new art and ideas. I would particularly like to thank Education and Public Engagement staff members, Andrea Calderes and Derek Wright, as well as the entire New Museum team for their help bringing this program together. New Museum digital initiatives are generously supported by Hermione and David B. Heller. We also thank our members and supporters, like you, who help make these programs possible. I will now share brief biographical notes about this program's featured artist. Dawoud Bey is an American photographer who has spent the past 40 years moving across genres, from street photography to portraiture to landscapes, to create a fuller, more complex picture of American society. His work has served to highlight both personal narratives and collective histories within the African American community. Bey's The Birmingham Project, 2012, which is featured in the New Museum exhibition, commemorates the lives of 6 young African Americans killed on September 15, 1963, in the bombing of the 16th Street Baptist Church and the ensuing protests in Birmingham, Alabama. Born in New York, Bey earned his MFA from Yale University School of Art, and is currently a professor of art and former distinguished college artist at Columbia College, Chicago. His works have been exhibited by and included in numerous institutional collections, such as Addison Gallery of American Art, Art Institute of Chicago, Brooklyn Museum, Detroit Institute of Arts, Fogg Art Museum at Harvard University, High Museum of Art in Atlanta, Museum of Contemporary Art Chicago, Museum of Modern Art New York, San Francisco Museum of Modern Art, Studio Museum in Harlem, Whitney Museum of American Art, National Gallery of Art, and other museums worldwide. He has been honored with various fellowships over the course of his long career, including a MacArthur Genius Award Fellowship, as well as a United States Artists Fellowship, a John Simon Guggenheim Memorial Foundation Fellowship, and a fellowship from the National Endowment for the Arts, among many others. Finally, I encourage you to learn more about upcoming public programs and our full suite of exclusive digital content on our website, newmuseum.org. And now, without further ado, I turn the conversation over to the New Museum's Kraus Family Curator, Gary Carrion-Murayari.
All right, thank you, Andrew, and thank you, everyone out there who's joining us today. I'm honored to be in conversation with Dawoud Bey, really tremendous photographer whose work, the Birmingham Project, has been one of the most, I think, special parts of this Grief and Grievance exhibition, and one of the projects that I think was on in some of the early conversations that the late curator of the show, Okwin Wezer, had with our team at the New Museum. Dawoud, as Andrew mentioned, has a long and distinguished career, and his work around photography and the possibilities for photography to both engage with community in lots of different formations, and also to deal with the collision of past and present within image making has made him one of the most influential photographers working today. We're going to start the conversation today focusing specifically on the Birmingham Project, and I think we'll see where we go. As some of you may know, this is a special project that Dawoud made by commission for the Birmingham Museum of Art, and a project that looks at the very influential history of civil rights within the Birmingham, the history of Birmingham, Alabama, and specifically, as Andrew mentioned, at the bombing of the 16th Street Baptist Church. It also, I think, is a project that has a very long and personal history for Dawoud, going back to some of his earliest memories of photography. I think maybe to start the conversation, Dawoud, first of all, thank you for joining us, and maybe we could start a little bit about with that very early experience of photography in the form of a book that led you to think about images around the Birmingham Project.
Well, there was, well, first of all, thank you guys, and thank all of you for joining us this afternoon. And thank you to the New Museum for doing these programs and for giving me the opportunity to talk a little bit more about the Birmingham Project and to give some background, which is not readily apparent from standing in front of the photographs themselves. So if we could put the slides up, because I have an image of the book. The Birmingham Project begins for me with this book, a book called The Movement, which was a book of photographs of and about the civil rights struggle. And it was a book that was put together by the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee as a fundraiser. And it was published in 1964. The Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee compiled the photographs and then asked the writer and playwright Lorraine Hansberry if she would write a text to kind of weave these photographs together into a book form. My parents brought this book home. They had gone to see a talk at the church that I grew up in Jamaica, Queens, a talk by James Baldwin. And after the talk, at the reception, the book was being sold. And so they brought this book home, and they didn't say too much about either Baldwin's talk or the book itself. They didn't tell me that it was urgent that I looked at the book. They just left it somewhere where I could get at it. I was 11 years old at the time. And so there were a lot of horrific photographs in this book, including, among other things, lynching photographs. And I guess you could say that included in this book were all of the horrific things that my parents had tried to protect me from up to that moment. And a number of the photographs in that book seared themselves into my psyche, including, if we go to the next slide, this image of Sarah Jean Collins. My life could probably be measured as my life before seeing this photograph and my life after seeing this photograph. I saw this photograph and it just seared itself deeply into my psyche. But I probably hadn't intuited at that moment was that I was pretty much the same age as the girl in the photograph, which very well may have had something to do with why this photograph affected me so deeply. But I never really forgot this photograph. I guess you could probably say I parked it somewhere in my subconscious. And I would say I always lose track of the time, but maybe 45 years later, or maybe even more, this photograph, the memory of it, came rushing back.
And Dawoud, just for those of those of us listening who don't know, Sarah Jean Collins was actually one of the survivors of the bombing, not one of the girls who perished, which I think else maybe some people don't know who don't know this image.
Sarah Jean Collins is the older sister of Addie Mae Collins, who was one of the 4 girls who was killed in the dynamiting of the 16th Street Baptist Church. And she's seen here in the hospital in the immediate aftermath. of the dynamiting of the church. And so decades later, this photograph just came rushing back with such force. I was laying in bed one morning and it just pushed me bolt upright in bed. And this photograph came back and I knew I needed to do something with that. I didn't quite know how, but it let me know that I had not completely forgotten this history and that it was very much a part of me. And so I decided that I needed to go to Birmingham, that I needed to see the place where this horrific history had unfolded. And I'd never been to Birmingham before. I didn't know anyone in Birmingham, but I scheduled a weekend visit to Birmingham, a Friday, Saturday, Sunday visit, definitely planning to attend a church service at the 16th Street Baptist Church on Sunday morning. I needed to, I guess you could say, bear witness to the place where this had happened and to also get a sense of the larger community in which it had taken place. So if we go to the next slide, these are the 4 girls who were killed in the dynamiting of the church. Next slide. And so I scheduled a visit to 16th Street Baptist Church, attended a service there, and afterwards I spoke briefly to the minister who was standing at the door as people left the church, greeting them, had a very brief exchange with the minister that gave me an immediate sense of how complicated this history and the relationship of that history to the present moment actually was. Because when I introduced myself to the minister, I told him my name and I told him I was an artist and photographer from Chicago and I was visiting and planning on coming back and making some work there. And he said, he asked me, what do you want to make work about? And I told him, well, I have an idea. I'm not sure, but I want to make some work about that moment, September 15th. And before I could really complete the sentence, he said, well, stop right there, because I have to tell you, here at 16th Street Baptist Church, we're not about all of that business. We're about the business of Jesus Christ. And my head was kind of quietly spinning. I didn't say anything because I didn't feel that it was my place as a visitor to certainly come into his church and tell him what his business might be. But it gave me a sense that I was entering into something that was much more complicated than I even realized. And the relationship of the community of Birmingham to that moment was more complex than I realized. And so, with his words still ringing in my ears and creating, I guess, a moment of, I have to say, confusion, I left the next morning and started doing research. I was actually in the midst of another project at the time, but eventually I started making periodic visits to Birmingham. And if you go to the next slide, I just started trying to familiarize myself with the place, making these small pictures with my point and shoot camera, a kind of visual note taking, including going to the neighborhood where 3 of the girls who had been killed in the bombing of the church had lived, a community in Birmingham called Smithfield. I just spent time in that community trying to take in as much as I could the experience of the place. Next slide. I was able to locate the grave site of one of the girls, Denise McNair, and I visited her grave site. The other 3 girls, I wasn't able to find their graves. I wanted to visit the grave site of all of them to pay a kind of proper tribute to them as I began to think about the work that I might undertake. Next slide. And I started doing research at the Birmingham Civil Rights Institute. I was introduced to the Birmingham Civil Rights Institute uh, through the Birmingham Museum of Art, because at some point I contacted the Birmingham Museum of Art, told them that I was interested in making work there, and would they be interested in partnering with me on this project and ultimately exhibiting whatever might come out of it. And quite frankly, I had no idea what that was going to be, but having done quite a number of collaborative projects with museums in the past, they made a tentative agreement to partner with me and to see how the work began to move forward. And I didn't want to just go there and make work about what I knew. I wanted to dig deeper and to try to get underneath the surface of that history and to get a deeper understanding of the place at that moment. So I started spending a lot of time at the Birmingham Civil Rights Institute. Next slide. Including the Reverend Fred Shuttlesworth archive at the Birmingham Museum of Art. Reverend Fred Shuttlesworth was the activist minister in Birmingham. He was the pastor of the church, Bethel Baptist Church in Birmingham, Alabama, which was the activist church. It was actually the church in which was formed the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. And I started steeping myself deeply in the history. This picture, one of the pictures that I uncovered in my research at the archive, the photograph on the upper right, is Reverend Fred Shuttlesworth being attacked by a bunch of white racists for trying to register his daughter in the local high school. What is most interesting about that photograph is the teenage boy at the center of that photograph, Frank Cherry, who turned out to be, as an adult, one of the Klansmen who was responsible for the dynamiting of the 16th Street Baptist Church. And below that, you see a picture of Bethel Baptist Church and the parsonage, which had been dynamited on Christmas Eve in I forget the exact year, but the parsonage of Birmingham had been dynamited. Birmingham had a nickname of Bombingham because the African American community was kept in a state of terror and intimidation by bombs routinely being planted in the African American community in Birmingham. Next slide. And it was during the research at the Birmingham Civil Rights Institute, I found out that not only had the 4 girls been killed in the dynamiting of the church that morning, along with 20 people who in the church who had been injured. But later that same day, two young African American boys, were killed in the violent aftermath of the dynamiting of the church. One of them, Johnny Robinson, was killed, shot in the back by a police officer in the streets of downtown Birmingham. After the dynamiting of the church, white citizens of Birmingham were driving around, flying Confederate flags, whooping it up, basically celebrating. The police said they saw Johnny Robinson throwing rocks at one of the cars that were flying a Confederate flag. And they called out to him, and he walked away, and the police officer lifted his shotgun and shot Johnny Robinson in the streets of Birmingham. And Virgil Ware was outside of Birmingham with his older brother, and they had just finished delivering their Sunday newspaper. And they encountered two white teenagers who were coming from what you might call a pep rally that had been held by the Ku Klux Klan and the White Citizens Council. They held a pep rally on the football field of the local high school to celebrate the dynamiting of the church that morning. And Virgil Ware and his brother were on their bicycle, and they encountered two white teenagers on a small motor scooter. And as they got closer to them, one of the white teenagers pulled out a pistol and took a shot at Virgil Ware and his brother. And he hit Virgil Ware, and Virgil Ware died in his brother's arms almost immediately. So with the knowledge of the two young African American boys being a part of the narrative of that day, which I didn't know, I knew that whatever I did would have to embrace them within the shape of the work that I was going to do. Next slide. So I started to think initially, people at the museum and people that I was meeting in the community were kind of tossing ideas at me. Why don't you make portraits of the older people who were involved in the movement? They called them the foot soldiers of the civil rights movement. And that didn't feel like an adequate enough gesture. I didn't just want to document either the presence or the place. I wanted to make something more resonant. I wanted to make the lives of those 6 young African Americans more palpable, more tangible. What does an 11-year-old Black girl look like? A 14-year-old Black girl, a 13-year-old Black boy, a 16-year-old Black boy? Then my original idea was to make portraits of young people in Birmingham who were the exact same ages as the 6 who had been killed. And even that idea left things feeling kind of incomplete. Now, mind you, time is passing by, and I'm periodically visiting Birmingham over the course of 7 or 8 years, actually, maybe even a little longer, as I complete other work and try to imagine what I might do in response to this horrific history, what I might make of this history. And I decided that I wanted to also somehow visualize the idea of loss, absence, the fact that their lives had been truncated, the lives that they were never allowed to have. And that's when I thought about photographing African Americans in Birmingham who were the ages that these young people would have been had they not been murdered that day. and then that I would place them together, make the photographs separately, but then put them together in the form of diptychs so that each diptych would represent 50 years, one being the year that these young people had been killed, 1963, and the older people being photographed in 2012. And I decided to make the photographs in two different locations. One of the locations being the Black communal space of the church. I spoke to the minister of Bethel Baptist Church, and he embraced the project immediately. And I wanted to use the communal space of the church and also to make work in the Birmingham Museum itself. The Birmingham Museum of Art during the time of the Civil Rights struggle, like all public institutions in the South, was a segregated institution. Black people could not visit the Birmingham Museum of Art until they eventually implemented one day called Negro Day, when African Americans could visit the museum. So I wanted both of those pieces of Birmingham's social history to wrap itself around the project and to give it a narrative context. Next slide, please. And so this is what you see, this diptych portrait here, made in Bethel Baptist Church. Working with the museum, we put out a very broad call for subjects. I hung out in barbershops and beauty parlors, made visits to the schools to talk to school groups and to talk to classes, in which the students would be the age of the young people that I was hoping to photograph, inviting them to participate in this project and to decide which was most convenient for them in terms of a place to come to be photographed. The museum is downtown Birmingham, which is very convenient for some people. And Bethel Baptist Church is in Collegeville, which is a little ways from downtown. So if people were living in that part of Birmingham and it was easier for them to get to the church, I pretty much left that up to them. One of the interesting things that happened almost immediately when I started to make appointments with the older people and told them I was at the museum, one afternoon, maybe, I'm at the museum and I'm waiting for the person to show up. And it's now 1 o'clock, now it's 1:15, now it's 1:30. And I asked my assistant, would you call Miss Parker for me? See if they need a ride or maybe they forgot. Because being photographed by the artist from Chicago is not necessarily at the top of anyone's priority list. When they get up in the morning, say, maybe she forgot. And my assistant called and she said, we were just wondering if you needed a ride or if there was a problem. And she said, I'm here. And we're like, you're here? Well, we're here. Where are you? He said, I'm at the museum. He said, well, we're at the museum. We're on the second floor. He said, I am on the second floor. They were like, where exactly are you? I'm at the Institute. She was at the Birmingham Civil Rights Institute, the museum. Because if you're older and you grew up in an era where you weren't even allowed to come to the Birmingham Museum of Art, when I say meet me at the museum, that's not necessarily your first thought. Which I thought was really interesting because most of the older people who came to the museum, just from the way they were looking around, I could tell that they'd never been in this building before, which of course was part of what the project was about. You know, my projects are always multiply layered, and they end up, resulting in photographs or diptychs or other kinds of objects. But for me, the whole project is the work. This kind of deterritorialization of the museum space, having people who once were not legally able to inhabit the museum not only come to be photographed there, but to realize that at the end of this, their photographs are going to hang on the walls of this very museum. All of that was part of the project. Go to the next slide. And eventually, in my conversations with the director of the Birmingham Museum of Art, which was Gail Andrews at that time, he finally told me, we've been talking about this project for a while, and 2013 is going to be the 50th year of this moment that you have been talking about. But we've been talking about this for a few years, 5, 6, 7, going into the 8th year. And she said, let's put it on the calendar for the 50th year, which of course seemed like the exact right moment for this work to have its first presentation. And so in September of 2013, almost 50 years to the day of the dynamiting of the 16th Street Baptist Church. Go to the next slide, please. The exhibition was mounted for the first time in the Birmingham Museum of Art. After I completed the diptych photographs, I came back and working with a production company, film production company, 6'5" Productions. I also made a split screen video work called 9/15/63, which is also a part of the larger Birmingham project. It's not at the new museum, but you will be able to see the video when my survey exhibition opens at the Whitney next month. There will be quite a few Birmingham pieces, diptychs, as well as the video. So that gives you, I hope, some sense of how the work that is currently on show as part of Grief and Grievance came into being.
It's such an amazing project and an amazing journey that I think you took to create the project. And I know, probably since the beginning of your work, there's the thoughtfulness about the relationship between the people that you are capturing in your photographs and who actually experiences those works is always been part of your thinking. And I think obviously in this one, it was such a, maybe even a more extended kind of conversation between yourself and the community in which you were working. One of the stories that I've read in the past about this series is also like the challenge you had in getting men to pose for the portraits. Maybe you could talk a little bit about that, which is maybe somewhat kind of an important part of the process in terms of getting the number of photographs you did, and that kind of like the kind of expansiveness that goes beyond, maybe just a simple call and people coming in and
with the Birmingham project.
With the Birmingham project, yeah.
Yeah, the interesting thing about this work is because they were diptychs, each photograph needed another photograph to complete the work. And when I started looking at bringing them together, the idea for why they belong together either dispositional, they had a similar emotional or psychological weight, or gestural, or in some cases physical, where there was an uncanny physical resemblance between the older person and the younger person. Each photograph had to speak to the other in a way that I guess you could say it had to be a kind of 1+1=3, that each one had to add up to together more than each one added up to individually, even as each diptych had to carry its own weight as an individual as well as a double portrait. And so there are photographs for this project that I made that actually just never found a second photograph to go with it. And because that was the conceptual shape of the work, I couldn't show them as individual photographs. And I was literally, my assistant was working the phone with people right down to the last moment of the last day that I was going to be there working. And what made it particularly difficult, it would have been a lot easier if I had just said, I want to photograph young people and older people in Birmingham. But for me, for the work to truly resonate, they needed to be that age. You know, the specificity of age is really important to me. They either needed to be that age at that moment, or they needed to be that age in 2013 when the work would first be shown publicly.
And
Because
how complicated were the like the conversations you had with, the adults versus the children? Obviously some of these adults, have probably very distinct memories of the bombing. And, the children, like, yeah.
it was interesting, which is also one of the reasons that it required my being in Birmingham as much as I ended up being there. Because with the older people, that was a horrific moment. They were in a state of state-sanctioned terror. And here comes an artist from Chicago who wants to stir that all up again, to bring those memories back, to ask them in the making of his work, not explicitly by implication, to recall those things. And there were people whom I had conversations, like the barber in the barber shop that I spent a lot of time in, whose photograph he is included in the project. But for the longest time, I had a suspicion. I kind of knew he was the right age, but he allowed me to hang out in the barber shop and find subjects that he himself did not volunteer to participate. It took a few years to win him over. So, because I don't think that people realize that not every Black person in Birmingham at the time of the movement was involved in the civil rights movement. It was a distinct minority of the African American population, because you were taking your life into your own hands by participating in the movement. So it wasn't something that everyone was doing, and it was not even something that everyone was talking about. I had a conversation with one older woman that I was photographing, and she said, you're making me remember things. And I remember when I was a young girl, I would periodically hear these explosions. And I would ask my mother what was going on. Because what was happening was that some African Americans house was being dynamited or dynamite was being planted near an African American's home. Maybe they had a new car in the driveway, and kind of how dare you have a new car when I don't have a new car, and then, you know, whatever. It didn't take much to provoke that kind of tension and extreme reaction. And she said, you know, I would ask my mother, what was that noise? And she never explained it. She said, oh, don't worry about that. That's just something that's going on. It wasn't like African American parents were talking about this to their children, because you certainly didn't want your child going out every morning in a state of sheer terror. You were trying to create as much normalcy for them as you could. So my being there and making this work, you know, brought back memories, provoked conversations that folks had not had, quite frankly, in a very long time, because those memories were far from pleasant. And it wasn't something that you wanted to meet your friend for breakfast and talk about. It was just, there were a lot of suppressed memories that were brought to the surface through this work.
Yeah, I think that's one of the kind of, I think, very powerful things about the project. And you know, in the catalog for your Whitney book, Imani Perry speaks a little bit about this, you know, maybe the degree to which, for those of us who haven't been to Birmingham, you know, the images of that moment, you know, are sort of frozen in time, frozen the city in time in a lot of ways. But it's a city that's, you know, the protests continued, and you know, tragedies have continued, but also lives have continued, and the city has changed, and in some ways, you know, become a blacker city, you know, over the past, you know, 50 plus years. And you know, that continuity and the lives that continued really shine through in these in those photographs that you've created and those people that you've engaged with the project. You know, I was also wondering about, you know, maybe the conversations with children, because I think, you know, obviously, you know, using children in the work is very challenging, but especially with this project where, you know, where it was an image of a child, you know, the survivor, you know, Sarah Collins, that inspired the project. But also I think, you know, the kind of the tragedy of that bombing as well, you know, given the fact that the role children had played, you know, in earlier in 1963 with the Children's Crusade, and you know, this kind of central role that children had in the successes of the civil rights movement. You know, to what degree were you having conversations about history with the children who participated, or you know, or maybe the reasons why they were interested in participating in the project?
Well, it was interesting because each time I visited a school to talk to a class of young people, the first thing I would do when I introduced myself to the classroom, and you know, these are kids who are 11, 12, so you're talking about fifth, sixth grade, and I would ask them, how many of you know what happened on September 15th, 1963? And pretty much every little hand went up. So these children were very much aware of the history that they were living inside of. Clearly, this history had been spoken about to them. I can't recall one young person who was unaware of that history. And there came a moment after several weeks where I had to take a week off from photographing, because there was a kind of emotional weight to it, especially when these children would come in. And the first time an 11-year-old girl showed up with her mother to be photographed, it just, my heart just caught, because an 11-year-old girl is a little child. It's not a 4 little girl. It's not some mythic, you know, quartet. It's a little girl. And my heart just caught when I saw that little girl and imagining that this could have been her. And in a deeper sense, it was her that day. You know, Denise McNair was the youngest of the four girls who were killed in the dynamiting of the chase. And in that blast, her head was blown clear off of her body. It was horrific, you know. And then to see an 11-year-old girl come walking in when I'm thinking about all of this, and you know, trying to remember and visualize and invoke this history as I'm making work about it. At some point, I just needed a week off because of the emotional intensity of photographing those young people and realizing exactly how young they really were.
And what was the response from both sides, when the final work was done and it was, shown in the museum? Like, what was that like? Because it's such a, it's a different experience, I think, obviously with all of your work, seeing yourself in that way, but especially with a project like this where it's
It's interesting because over the years, I've never intruded on the individuals that I photograph when the work is up on the wall and they see themselves on the wall of a museum. Uh, the girl who was in one of the first diptych that I showed, she just kept laughing. Just this idea that she's hanging on the wall in this museum, it was just kind of like the most, it wasn't exactly funny, but it was just completely unexpected.
Mhm.
For the adults, of course, it had a very different kind of weight. And I think it was the moment that they fully realized exactly what I was up to here. You know, seeing
Yeah.
themselves in this museum, like we're in this museum, but not at the Institute. Which is, if you're Black and in Birmingham and you're in a museum, you're probably at the Institute. You know, that was just a given. So I think the adult had a very different sense at that point of exactly what my whole project was about, because it was always leading up to this moment.
Right. Yeah. Yeah, I can't even imagine what that bringing people together in that way was such a special thing. I wanted to go maybe back a little bit towards talking about within the context of this exhibition, Grief and Grievance. I think photography plays a very, I think, important role, and I think this is something that Oakley was thinking about with this project, and I know had been thinking about with other projects that he worked on. In terms of the specific imagery around the civil rights movement, but I think also around images of of violence in general. The discussion about how photography can speak to that kind of history. I think your work presents a challenge, and a very interesting challenge to that. And I think that's something you see in other parts of the show, whether it's something like Carrie Mae Weems's work, where she's kind of constructing an image of history, or even the earliest work in the show, like Jack Whitten's piece of Birmingham, where that image, that very famous image from the newspaper, is almost obscured within, buried in the surface of the painting. Did your working through this project, or creating images that still somehow speak to that history, but with coming at it from a different perspective, did that change through the course of the project? And how much?
Yeah, this was a very transformative project for me in terms of changing the conceptual framework through which I make my work, and which I've continued to make my work, because it was the first time that I really started thinking about how does one represent or visualize the past in the contemporary moment in a way that makes that history resonate. And I think photography is always, or very often, trapped within the condition of its literalness. And I don't think that people always always think about photographs as being an object that's the result of the imagination, of an imagined condition that is rooted in history. But this isn't the person. But when you look at it, it is the person. You know, to create something that has that weight. This was the first time that I came to that set of ideas and that conceptual frame for working. So working on that project just kind of fundamentally changed my work. You know, it required that I change the way I thought about my work in order to meet the conditions of expectation that I had for myself. I didn't want to just make a picture of the thing. Like, how do you make work when the thing you want to make work about isn't there?
Right.
What do you do then? And so in solving that, it just gave me a whole different conceptual framework for thinking about the work that I've gone on to make.
There's you know, again in the catalog for your Whitney show, there's a great quote that Stephen Nelson says where it's something like that you're, you know, that in this project you're subjecting history to the forces of, I think, collective memory and individual experience. And I think that's a really interesting way, especially to think about the specific history of Birmingham. You know, these images that, documentary images, images in the press that had become so famous, you know, are used in certain ways. And in this way, you actually are, you know, acting upon our understanding of history in a really, a powerful way. And you're actually giving, you know, the people of Birmingham an opportunity to kind of, you know, play a more active role in that history, which I think is quite
I
special.
want this work to resonate as deeply as the work that does in fact function in a more literally documentary kind of way. I mean, I want you to look at that work and to have a visceral response. You know, certainly the ways in which that is engaged is through a different set of conceptual and visual poetics. You know, it's not immediately apparent that the work is as visceral as it is. It's a kind of quietness to it that I think grows on you in an even deeper way, which tends to be the way I think about my work. I want the work to work on you in a deeper way, not for it to have an immediately jarring effect on you, and not to give itself up all at once.
Yeah, well, I think, I think your process with this project, I think, resulted in that, made that possible. I think that the care and the time that you took in that process had it operate on a different scale. One other thing I was thinking in relationship to the exhibition as well, and again, imagining history, obviously this is a show about, mourning and about memory. And in, a certain way, these photographs also function as a different kind of memorial, both in, the way that they're dealing with the past, but also I think in the way that they deal with public space in Birmingham, like, how this, the space, like the communal space of the church, the space in the museum that, ostensibly is supposed to be a public space, but obviously has not functioned in that way for the Black community in Birmingham over the course of its history. Had you thought much about that idea of a memorial, or, in some ways, you even think about the idea of discussions we have about monuments in relationship to mourning?
Absolutely. It is simultaneously a memorial to those individuals, a memorial to that moment, as much as it is a representation of the contemporary community of Birmingham, because all of the people in the photograph are living in Birmingham now. So I guess, with that in mind, you can kind of reference it as a sort of living memorial.
Yeah. No, I think it's a really special project. And, I know some people were also interested in maybe, what have you taken from this project since, in terms of what you've been working on since? I think there's been this engagement with history and, some of the ways that your photographs can function in relationship to history maybe has changed since the Birmingham project.
Well, I wanted to continue making work that references African American history, and obviously to reference it through a contemporary set of circumstances. And so the Birmingham project was followed by Night Coming Tenderly Black, which was a commission from the front triennial in Cleveland, Ohio. They asked me to participate, and I told them I would participate, but I need to keep working through this idea that I'm in the midst of. I said, if I can find something in Cleveland, Ohio, that allows me to continue to think through this idea of collapsing the past and present around African American history. And so I started doing research and quickly uncovered that Cleveland and Northeastern Ohio played a significant role in African American history because of its proximity to Lake Erie. And Lake Erie was the final destination along the Northeastern Ohio route of the Underground Railroad. So once I realized that, I said, okay, I'm in. I want to start thinking about this particular piece of African American history. The Underground Railroad, which, of course, of necessity, no one ever knew the exact locations of the Underground Railroad. There are people who have done a kind of sociological and anthropological research into the exact sites, for example, of those places called Underground Railroad stations, where African Americans took temporary refuge as they moved along what was called the Underground Railroad. And that kind of research kind of like puts you in a parking lot, or it puts you at a gas station, or a CVS that now stands on that site. That's the kind of literalness that I'm not really interested in. Mm-hmm. And because those locations were not, for the most part, known, it gave me the freedom to begin to imagine that landscape in proximity to a few known locations, but mainly imagining this landscape as if it were that landscape. And the fugitive African Americans moving through that landscape on the way to Lake Erie. I kind of knew where I had to end up. I had to end up at Lake Erie. Mm-hmm. And then I had to kind of imagine a kind of pathway from Hudson, Ohio, into Cleveland, and then to Lake Erie. So I started photographing in Hudson, Ohio. And John Brown and his sons, Hudson, Ohio had a strong abolitionist community. And one can presume that the abolitionists were also some of the people who were giving fugitive African American refuge, temporary refuge in their homes. So because I knew that John Brown's house once stood here, that kind of gave me the freedom to explore the landscape around that house in proximity to it, to kind of imagine the condition of fugitivity and then to visualize that. And then with that work, because a lot of that movement was taking place under cover of darkness, I had two conceptual points of reference. When I began to think about the Black subject moving through the Black space, and that coming to reside in a very dark or Black photographic object, that brought me immediately to Roy DeCarava. It pretty much, that no one else occupies that space.
Yeah.
So conceptually, I thought that this would be an interesting moment and opportunity for me to bring those things that were part of Carruthers' work into my own conception of the Underground Railroad. And I also thought about the final couplet in Langston Hughes' poem that says, "Night coming tenderly, black like me." And that seemed kind of, to my mind, very much a part of also the narrative of Carruthers' beautiful blackness in his photograph. So the two of them became the conceptual and material point of reference for what became the Underground Railroad work, Night Coming Tenderly.
Yeah,
Black.
it's really, I mean, a stunning body of work. Somebody in the chat was asking, whether that work is reproduced, but in the catalog for the Whitney Show, 2 American Projects, you can see some of those images, and it's an absolutely, one of my favorite series. So, I think
one final thing about that that I want to say, because it goes all the way back to my beginning of making the work in Harlem and showing that work in the Studio Museum in Harlem. This relationship that can be made to exist between the work and the site in which the work is situated.
Yeah.
How a kind of dynamic relationship between the work, the site, and the larger community in which the work can be made is something that I've thought about for a long time too. Because the Night Coming Tenderly Black was first shown, they were installed in St. John's Episcopal Church in Cleveland, and St. John's Episcopal Church was actually the last stop, the last place of refuge for fugitive African Americans before they made the final leg of their journey to Lake Erie. So this idea of situating the work in a place that is very much part of the narrative of the history that the work comes out of, much like, the Birmingham Museum or the church in Birmingham. The sighting of the work and how I think about that is something that is very much a part of the work.
Yeah, no, I think that's a beautiful through line through so much of your work is, making those connections, or at least, highlighting those connections between, subject and audience and the institutional framework that somehow exists in between them. I think that's such an important part of what you do. I know maybe there was a couple more questions that people had. I know somebody asked if you could talk a little bit about the way that the Birmingham Project was received within the larger community in Birmingham, not necessarily just the people who are, participants in the project, but, once the work was shown, what was that reception like?
The work, it was very strongly received in Birmingham, because, especially because of the moment. It was the 50th year of this particular incident that my work references and memorializes, and it allowed the work to become a container for a lot of things at that moment. Because with the Birmingham Museum of Art basically being the only museum in Birmingham other than the Institute, it allowed me to situate the work in a very public conversation. And people took to it. I mean, eventually, even those people who had initially been reluctant to engage because they just didn't want to think about it and they didn't want all of that to be drawn up, again, kind of rallied around the work. So I would say that it was very well and meaningfully received. I have a very large community in Birmingham now that I'm very close to. I consider myself in a way to be, after all the years spent there, a part of that community. And I go back there periodically.
That's great. I think, oh, so there maybe one more question about in Birmingham, somebody's asking if that minister who, you had that kind of surprising conversation with at the beginning, came to see the exhibition. The minister who, who you spoke to at the beginning of the project. Yeah.
Absolutely not. Absolutely
Yeah.
not. He made it very clear. And actually, when the exhibition opened and he didn't come, there was a lot of conversations around in Birmingham at that moment, because his church was the moment that this incident was at the center of the moment that was going to be commemorated. And he did not want to participate.
Yeah.
He was ultimately a very reluctant participant in that moment. Over the years, when I went back, for years, there was not a marker for the 4 girls or anything that recognized and memorialized the moment of the death of those 4 girls. And I finally went one year and saw a marker. And I said to someone, "Oh, the Reverend's coming around, huh?" And they said, "Nah, that's not him. He didn't put that there. He's a minister. He's there to minister to his congregation. He's not there to be the museum of September 15th, 1963. Although the church is open, and I encourage everyone who's watching, the church does have tours and lectures at the church. I think it's on, I don't know, you can go online and find out. But there are tours of the church around that history. I think one day a week, probably Saturday. And I strongly encourage everyone to make what you might call a pilgrimage to that church, because it's a very important piece of our history. But, and actually during the opening, I had a bunch of friends who came down, and so we did the tour on a Saturday. And as we were sitting there, the minister came out because he needed to ask the person who was giving us the talk something. And I saw him, and I haven't seen him since the beginning, and since a very touchy meeting that we had, where he let me know that he supported it, but he couldn't support it in any tangible way. And so when I saw him that last time, I just got up and walked over to him and shook his hand, and I told him I understand. I said, this is my work. This is the work that I do. You have the work that you do. I get it, and I want you to know that it's okay. I kind of had to, deal with that moment, because when he first told me that, I absolutely didn't get it. But in his mind, he has much more urgent work to do than to be preoccupied with something that happened 50 odd years ago.
Yeah. Well, those are,
one final thing I would suggest also, if you're interested in this history, some of you may know the historian Taylor Branch, who has written extensively on this history. And he has a book, Parting the Waters. And I met Taylor Branch, and I was working on a project in Baltimore, and had just gone down to Birmingham, Alabama. And I met Taylor, and I told him, Taylor, I went to Birmingham. I met the minister of 16th Street Baptist Church, and Taylor Branch gave me a knowing look. He said, "Oh, that must have been interesting." And he talks about all of those seeming contradictions in the book. I would not have been so surprised if I had given his book one more reading before I went down there, because those tensions in Birmingham within the African American community have always existed. They have something to do with class, among other things. And the fact that in relation to 16th Street Baptist Church, there's 3 16th Street Baptist Church. There's the building, the actual church, there's the congregation, and then there are the mass meetings that took place at 16th Street during the Civil Rights Movement that were organized by Dr. King, Smith, and Southern Christian Leadership Conference. The members of the congregation at 16th Street Baptist Church were never at any of those meetings. I always assumed that they were the same thing.
Right.
That the congregation and the movement, I always assumed that it was the same thing. They were not. Most of the people at those mass meetings were actually from Bethel Baptist Church and from First Congregational Church. They came from other churches and they met at 16th Street Baptist Church because it was centrally located. It's a very complicated history because I came to realize that even though the ministers back then and the congregation were not at those meetings, if the minister really didn't want those meetings to happen there, they would have simply padlocked the door.
Right.
So obviously they were making the space available without explicitly doing so. Because to do so explicitly would have put them in great danger.
Right. Yeah.
They showed up to work. Did I see you at all of that foolishness at 16th Street Baptist Church this past? You needed to be able to say, no, I was not there. But it's a complicated history, and I spent enough time there to come away with an almost encyclopedic knowledge of all of those inherent contradictions. Because history is always more complicated than the mythic history that we come to receive.
Yeah. Well, without your photographs now, I think themselves have played an important part in continuing that discussion around that history. And I think both for myself, but for many of us who've experienced the Birmingham Project. So, I want to thank you for that. And also for being a part of Grief and Grievance. It's, I think your work really gets at the heart at the heart of a lot of questions that are happening, in the show across medium, whether it's painting or film and video or photography. And I hope that everyone also comes to see your exhibition at the Whitney, Two American Projects, that opens next month. Again, thank you for spending the time talking with us today.